People often ask me when I became a psychologist. The truth is, I never set out to be one. I was a child scientist, fascinated by the natural world. At age 10, I was already peering into microscopes, documenting the habits of snails with a seriousness that confused the adults around me. One of my early papers on mollusks was so technical that it was published in a biology journal, under the impression that I was a university student. I never corrected them. I just kept observing, writing, thinking. But it wasn't snails I was truly obsessed with. It was structure, systems, patterns in how things develop, how they become what they are. That curiosity slowly turned inward. I began to wonder, how do we develop? Not just physically, but mentally. How does a child come to understand the world? Not memorize it, but actually construct meaning. It struck me that our minds are not blank slates, nor are they simply filled up by instruction. There had to be something deeper, something active, something alive inside the learning process itself. Later, when I worked in Paris at Alfred Binet's laboratory, I was tasked with helping standardize intelligence tests. The job was straightforward: observe children's responses and score them. But I became fixated on something others ignored: the wrong answers. Children didn't just guess randomly. They were wrong in consistent, patterned ways. These errors weren't meaningless. They revealed a kind of logic, one very different from the adult mind, but no less systematic. I realized then that children weren't just less knowledgeable than adults. They were thinking in entirely different ways. That idea changed everything for me. I began observing children closely, not as a distant academic, but as someone trying to enter their world. I watched my own 3 children, Lucienne, Laurent, and Jacqueline, grow and reason and stumble. I didn't correct them, I listened. When Lucienne insisted the moon followed her, I didn't laugh, I asked why. When Laurent believed that pouring water into a wider glass made it less, I wrote it down. These moments were small windows into evolving mental structures, into what I later called cognitive development. People thought I was trying to create a new theory of education. I wasn't. I was trying to see the child's mind from the inside out. I wanted to understand the roots of knowledge, not as something taught, but as something invented. I came to believe that each child is a builder of their own understanding, not a vessel to be filled, but a structure under construction. That belief stayed with me for the rest of my life. What I discovered, what truly shaped my career, was not that children think differently from adults. That was already known. What fascinated me was that their thinking changes in clear, measurable stages. It doesn't evolve randomly. It grows in structure, like a tree expanding from a seed, each branch representing a new form of reasoning. I came to define 4 major stages in the development of thought. They didn't emerge from theory, but from thousands of hours of observation and dialogue with children. The first is what I called the sensory motor stage, from birth to about 2 years. At this stage, infants know the world only through action. They see, touch, grasp, taste. They don't know an object exists if it leaves their sight. But slowly, something incredible happens. They begin to understand object permanence, that a toy, hidden under a blanket, still exists. This is not a small thing. It is the foundation of symbolic thought, of memory, of imagination, of language. The next phase, the pre-operational stage, begins around 2 and lasts until about 7. Here, the child explodes with language and imagination. They play pretend, they draw and tell stories, but their logic is still rooted in perception. They cannot yet conserve quantity. They may tell you that 5 candies spread apart are more than 5 candies placed close together. They see the world as it looks, not as it is. And they remain egocentric, not selfish, but unable to fully grasp another's perspective. When Jacqueline covered her eyes and said, "Now you can't see me," I smiled, not because she was wrong, but because she was thinking logically within her world. Then comes the concrete operational stage, around 7 to 11. Now the child begins to master logic, real, structured, but still grounded in the tangible. They can sort, classify, understand conservation, reverse operations in their minds. Ask them whether pouring water into a different shaped glass changes the amount, and they will correct you. But ask them to reason about justice or hypotheticals, and they may struggle. Abstraction is not yet theirs. That comes with the formal operational stage from around 12 and beyond. Now the child, soon adolescent, can reason about ideas. They begin to grasp algebra, ethics, politics. They can imagine futures, question norms, form hypotheses, and debate possibilities. Their minds are no longer limited to what is. They can now think about what could be. To me, these stages were not rigid boxes, but scaffolding. They showed that intelligence is built in layers. A child cannot leap from one to the next without internal transformation. You cannot force abstraction onto a mind still grounded in sensation. This is what I believe so deeply. Learning is not transmission, it is transformation. Development guides instruction, not the other way around. And this is what too many forget. A child is not a passive receiver of knowledge. They are an active constructor of it. They build, test, fail, revise. They are little scientists of the everyday world. Just like I once was. I have never trusted sterile laboratories. Psychology, to me, should not be built on artificial environments, wires, and commands barked through one-way mirrors. The real laboratory is the everyday world of the child, filled with curiosity, frustration, wonder, and error. My greatest experiments were not conducted in white rooms. They took place at the family dinner table, during walks in the garden, in quiet conversations beside a cradle. My children, without knowing it, became my collaborators, not my subjects, my guides. I never gave them lectures or treated them as data points. I asked questions. Simple ones, almost playful. I would present two identical glasses of water. Then, I'd pour one into a wider, shorter glass and ask, which has more? If they said the taller one, I didn't correct them. I asked why. Their explanations revealed far more than their answers. This one goes higher, they'd say. It was not wrong. It was logical within their frame of reference. They had not yet built the concept of conservation. But they weren't broken. They were developing. This, I believe, is one of the most profound misunderstandings in how adults view children. We often judge them by adult standards, dismissing their mistakes as silly or immature. But in those so-called mistakes, there is order, pattern, structure. I remember asking Laurent to describe what someone else might see from the opposite side of a model mountain. He insisted that person would see what he saw, not out of selfishness, but because his logic hadn't yet included the possibility of other perspectives. I saw in that moment something important. Empathy isn't just emotional, it's cognitive, and it must be constructed like everything else. I called these exercises clinical interviews. They were not tests in the traditional sense. I wasn't looking for right or wrong. I was searching for the underlying reasoning, for the logic that shaped the child's perception. What fascinated me wasn't whether the child got the correct answer. It was how they arrived there, or didn't. I listened carefully to the words they used, the metaphors, the gestures. Each child offered a glimpse into a mind in motion, reasoning not as we do, but in a rhythm of their own. Over time, these patterns became clear. The same stages appeared again and again, in different children, in different countries, in different contexts. Development, I began to see, was not a cultural product. It was human, and it unfolded in an order too consistent to be coincidence. I did not discover this from numbers, but from watching, from asking, from allowing the child's mind to speak in its own language. I never believed in pure objectivity. My children were not just my data. They were my teachers. They reminded me that the search for truth is never cold. It is personal, intimate, and often filled with contradiction. I learned to trust the slowness of development, to resist the temptation to accelerate, to correct, to intervene too early. You must let the mind build itself through action, failure, accommodation, rethinking. The invisible laboratory where I worked all those years wasn't filled with machines. It was filled with thinking minds in the process of formation. And in those minds, I found the raw material of reason, the roots of logic, the construction of knowledge from the ground up. We do not think because we are taught to. We think because we must, because our minds are builders. And even in the youngest child, the blueprint is already unfolding. People often imagine that learning is something that happens to us. A fact enters the mind, and there it stays. But that's not how I've come to see it, not from years of watching children think. Learning, in truth, is not the passive reception of information. It is an active construction, a constant negotiation between what we already know and what we are just beginning to discover. And this negotiation follows three fundamental processes: assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. Let me begin with assimilation. This is the mind's first instinct. When a child encounters something new, their first response is to make it fit into what they already understand. Imagine a young child who has only ever seen dogs. One day, they see a horse for the first time. They point and say, "Dog." It's not a mistake. It's a perfect example of assimilation. They're applying an existing category, four-legged furry animal, to a new but unfamiliar experience. They're trying to preserve what they know. Assimilation helps us preserve mental order, but it also has limits. Eventually, the child realizes a horse doesn't bark. It doesn't wag its tail. It's too big, it behaves differently. The category dog begins to strain under the weight of contradiction. This is where accommodation steps in. The mind now has to adjust, to reshape its internal categories to better match reality. The child creates a new concept, horse, and places it alongside dog. They don't just name things differently, they think differently. Their understanding of animals becomes more refined, more nuanced. Accommodation is more demanding than assimilation. It takes effort. It requires the child to admit, even unconsciously, that their current understanding is no longer sufficient. But in that very moment of disequilibrium, when something doesn't quite fit, growth becomes possible. And this brings us to the third process, equilibration. This is the mind's silent goal, the drive toward balance between assimilation and accommodation. It's not a static balance, but a dynamic one. A child wants things to make sense. They want coherence. When the world no longer fits their expectations, they experience cognitive dissonance, confusion, discomfort, even frustration. But this discomfort is productive. It motivates them to resolve the conflict by reorganizing their thinking. Over time, this leads to a new equilibrium, a more stable, more advanced understanding of the world. And then the process begins again. These three mechanisms are not steps to be followed. They are the very engine of intellectual development. I have seen them unfold countless times. When my daughter Lucienne reached for a ball and it rolled away instead of coming to her hand, I could almost see her reasoning shift in real time. First, she tried to repeat the same action, assimilating the experience into her idea of object permanence. But then she paused, hesitated, adapted. She tried something new. That was accommodation. And when she finally grasped the ball, after adjusting her approach, I saw her smile. That was equilibrium regained. What fascinates me is how these processes echo throughout our lives. We often think of development as something that happens in childhood and then ends. But I believe it continues. When adults confront new ideas, when we move to a new culture, read a book that challenges us, face a contradiction in our beliefs, we too assimilate, accommodate, and seek equilibrium. Our minds are always constructing, refining, rebuilding. The difference is that children do it more openly, more boldly. They have no shame in being wrong. Their entire existence is built on the assumption that knowledge can and should change. So I began to see intelligence not as a fixed trait, but as a process of self-regulation. The mind is not a mirror, it is an architect. It doesn't merely reflect reality, it reorganizes itself to understand it. And in that self-reorganization lies the very essence of thought. This is why I've never believed in pouring knowledge into children. To teach well, we must respect the learner's need for conflict, challenge, and rebalancing. We must allow them to rebuild their understanding, not hand them ready-made answers. Because only what the child constructs will truly be understood. When people speak of my work now, they often forget that it was not always welcomed. Many of my ideas were challenged, debated, even misunderstood. And I welcome that. In science, criticism is not an attack. It is the continuation of the conversation. I never believed I held the final truth. My goal was not to deliver answers, but to offer a framework, one rooted in careful observation and evolving understanding. But even frameworks, like children's minds, must be tested and reshaped. Some critics said I underestimated children, that my tasks were too difficult, too language-dependent, or culturally narrow. They showed that under different conditions, children often succeed earlier than I predicted, and they were right. I had not accounted for the role of language, culture, or social interaction as fully as I should have. Others pointed out that development is not as rigidly staged as I once thought, that children may use formal operations in one domain but not another, that progress is uneven. Again, I do not deny it. The mind is not a machine. It does not move in perfect symmetry, but I never saw my stages as strict compartments. They were approximations, traces of how intelligence tends to unfold. Perhaps the most famous counterpoint came from Lev Vygotsky, whose ideas I have always respected. Where I emphasized individual construction of knowledge, he emphasized the social nature of thought. He believed that learning is first interpersonal, that it begins between people, and only later becomes internalized. He introduced the idea of the zone of proximal development, the gap between what a child can do alone and what they can do with help. In this, we differed. I believed that real understanding could not be given, it must be constructed from within. But I never denied that social context matters. It does. The dialogue between learner and teacher, between peers, between cultures, that is part of the environment in which the child builds their thought. Perhaps where I focused on the builder, Vygotsky reminded us of the scaffolding. As years passed, researchers in neuroscience, cognitive science, and education began to expand on these ideas. Brain imaging showed the neural correlates of development. Experiments became more precise. Data grew more abundant. And yet, again and again, I saw my core principles echoed. That children are active participants in their learning, that their errors are meaningful, that understanding must follow development, not precede it. I do not see these modern findings as rejections of my work. I see them as evolution. Ideas must evolve. Theories must adapt. That is the very logic of development I described. Assimilation, accommodation, equilibrium. My own work, too, has gone through these stages in the minds of others. It has been challenged, reshaped, and absorbed into newer models. What matters most to me is not whether my original stages are followed exactly, but whether we continue to ask the same fundamental questions. How does knowledge form? How do we move from confusion to understanding. What makes a thought ours, truly and deeply? I have been called a developmental psychologist, a philosopher, a biologist. In truth, I never cared much for labels. I have always seen myself as a student of structure, of how things grow, transform, stabilize, and begin again. My contribution, if any, is not a doctrine, but a perspective, that the mind is not a passive receiver, but an active constructor, and that in each construction lies the history of reason itself. I did not set out to reform education. I was never a teacher in the traditional sense, nor did I write pedagogical manuals or design school curricula. Yet of all the places my work has reached, the classroom has perhaps been the most fertile ground. I am often called the father of constructivist education, a term I did not invent, but one that captures the essence of what I observed in children. If a child constructs knowledge through interaction with the world, then education must respect the pace, structure, and logic of that construction. Too often, education treats learning as transmission. The teacher holds knowledge, the student receives it. But this model, while convenient for organization, ignores how minds actually work. You cannot simply tell a child what to understand. You can provide experiences, offer guidance, provoke questions, but the actual understanding must be built internally. A child may memorize that 3 times 4 equals 12, but if they cannot explain why or connect it to real quantities, the idea remains hollow. Real understanding is not a performance. It is a reconstruction. I visited many classrooms throughout my life, and what moved me most were not the ones filled with facts, but the ones filled with curiosity. Classrooms where children explored, touched, questioned, argued, not to mimic the teacher, but to test their own mental models. I have always believed that a child's errors are far more valuable than their correct answers. The error tells us where the structure is. It shows us the boundary of their current logic. To correct without understanding that logic is to fix a surface crack while ignoring the foundation. This is why I admired educators who treated the classroom as a living laboratory. Maria Montessori, for example, created environments where children could move freely, choose their materials, and follow their interests within a structure that respected developmental timing. In such settings, learning is not forced, it emerges. And when it emerges from within, it becomes lasting. One of the greatest mistakes we make in education is to impose abstraction too early. We give children algebra before they truly understand quantity. We teach formal definitions before they have grasped the concrete patterns that give those definitions meaning. My stages of development were never meant to restrict what children can do. They were meant to remind us when they are ready. Readiness is not an arbitrary threshold. It is a sign of internal equilibrium, the point at which the mind can assimilate and accommodate new ideas without confusion or collapse. I have said before, every time we teach a child something, we prevent them from discovering it for themselves. This is not a condemnation of teaching, but a warning. If we rush in with explanations before the child has questioned, tested, wondered, we may steal from them the most essential part of learning, the joy of invention. Education, at its best, is not instruction. It is construction under guidance. The teacher is not a transmitter, but a guide, a fellow thinker who understands that knowledge must be rebuilt inside the learner's mind. The more we honor this process, the more we move toward a human education, one that respects the child not as a future adult, but as an active thinker in the present. My hope has always been simple, that we stop asking, how can we teach better? And begin asking, how does the child learn? Only then can education cease to be a delivery system and become a partnership in thought. When I reflect on the decades I spent observing children, watching them reach, question, fail, adjust, I do not see research, I see a mirror, because what I found in them I have always recognized in myself. The search for understanding is not a trait of childhood, it is the condition of being human. We are all, from infancy to old age, builders of meaning. The structures grow more complex, the questions more abstract, but the process, the construction, remains the same. Many assume that cognitive development ends with adolescence. They see my stages as a staircase, and once we reach the top, we stop climbing. But I never believed that. I saw thinking not as a finished product, but as a lifelong adaptation. Adults too assimilate and accommodate. We reorganize our beliefs, wrestle with contradictions, seek new equilibrium when the world challenges what we once thought was true. If a scientist abandons a theory, if a parent adjusts to a child's needs, if a citizen rethinks justice, this is development. This is growth. The tools we begin building in childhood remain with us. They simply change form. Today, I see my ideas echoed in places I never imagined. In neuroscience, where researchers observe the brain actively reconstructing memory, not storing it like a file, but rebuilding it each time we recall. In artificial intelligence, where machines attempt, in their own limited way, to mimic the layered acquisition of knowledge. In classrooms that encourage play, exploration, inquiry, instead of rote answers and uniform solutions. And in conversations like this one, where people continue to ask not just what we think, but how we think. Sometimes people ask me, with all we now know, has your work become outdated? I smile at the question because it misunderstands the nature of ideas. I never intended to offer final answers. I offered a framework, a language for observing the unfolding of thought. Like all frameworks, it must be revised, expanded, reinterpreted. That is not failure. That is the very process I described. Knowledge grows by being challenged, by being rebuilt. I do not need my name to be remembered. What I hope endures is something deeper, a respect for the mind as a living, evolving system. A belief that error is not the opposite of learning, but its raw material. That to truly educate, we must honor the logic of the learner, not replace it with our own. And that the child is not a vessel waiting to be filled, but a thinker already in motion. You may never notice it, but every time you question a habit, confront a new idea, or change your mind, you are still developing, still adapting, still, in some small way, the child you once were, reaching toward understanding, constructing meaning, searching for balance between what is known and what is possible. So if anything I've written has value, let it be this: trust the process, in yourself, in others, in the unfolding architecture of the mind, because the work of thought is never finished, and neither are we.